In this short video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the scope and sequence table. I'm going to talk a little about what it is, give you some examples of scope and sequence tables, and then show you why scope and sequence is important for your instructional design and development. Scope and sequence comes at the intersection of design and development and informs your actual implementation of the curriculum. So far, as you can see from this graphic, you've analyzed the task, you've analyzed the learner, and you've analyzed the types of knowledge included in your curriculum. You've applied curriculum design, instructional design of how in general you're going to teach each one of these knowledge types, and you have created this initial blueprint that will be expanded later into actual lesson plans and the actual materials for your curriculum. So the scope and sequence is the initial stage of a development phase in which you're going to analyze your outcomes from your curriculum against the units that you're proposing, and to be able to see what gaps there may be in the units and how the strategies in your lesson designs can enhance the student achievement. And we'll see how that works a little bit later. There are many examples of scope and sequence tables, sometimes called scope and sequence charts. All you have to do is Google scope and sequence, and you'll see that there are millions of variations of a scope and sequence. I'm showing you one here so you can see what one example looks like, and this is a recent example from a curriculum that we offer at Rossier for the Masters in Learning Design and Technology. Notice that there are courses along the first row, and then along the first column there are the outcomes from the course or proficiencies that you anticipate the students will achieve. And then notice further that there are I's, R's, and M's. The I means you're introducing this skill or concept or skill to the learners in this particular course. The R is reinforcing, and what that means is that you're reinforcing the skill by having the students apply the skill to a new context. This is a near transfer of learning from the skill. You give them another example, or they come up with another example themselves. So it's in a new context, and this is transfer of learning, a near transfer of learning, but it reinforces the skill. And then with numerous reinforcements, you should reach a certain level of expertise or mastery of the skill. And mastery would be demonstrated by the learners transferring their knowledge and skill of performance in that task to a yet new context that's farther out in the transfer, but maybe the context of their own problem of practice, for example. So we are looking at where the introduction, the reinforcement, and the mastery occurs for each one of these outcomes within the curriculum itself. Now we're going to return to this a little bit later, and I'll show you some of the uses of the scope and sequence chart or table, and how to analyze some of these blanks that you see in the various cells. To give you more conceptual background to scope and sequencing, I'd like you to read chapter 16 in the Smith and Reagan text, Macro Strategies, Integration of Types of Learning. So what does that mean, that title? It means that so far in your design, you have been designing based upon a task analysis and learner analysis. You've been designing units. We would call those micro strategies for designing units. But when you put units together, or modules together, and courses together, then we're on a macro level, and we call these the macro level or otherwise known as curriculum development. So you can see how then this is important to your curriculum design project, in which you need to incorporate macro strategies to integrate the various types of learning that you have included in your curriculum design. This diagram is a summary of macro strategies. It's found on page 297 in the Smith & Reagan 3rd edition. I'm showing it to you just to review several ideas, the highlights, if you will, of this chapter, so you can review them in detail with a little bit of scaffolding here, or help you to organize it. But you have various curriculum sequencing structures along the top: world-related structure, inquiry-related structure, utilization-related structures, learning-related structures. And then you also have ways of integrating curriculum with tools and concepts to do that. I want to point out that curriculum designers often mix and match and adapt these, both the curriculum sequencing structures and the use of the tools for integrating the curriculum. It's not in black and white, either or, exclusive to this or exclusive to that. These are ideas that you want to integrate into your own philosophy and, once again, worldview you have of how learning and instruction works, and also to what's the best to the benefit of your learners. To that end, what's the benefit of your learners? You want to look on page 296 and the prescriptions for curriculum design, and what the prescriptions are in adapting your curriculum to the context, the learners, the learning tasks, and the purpose of the curriculum. So you might find that the utilization-related structure could be considered as one of the primary structures of our curriculum design projects. Why is that? Because we are basing ours on the primary and fundamental question of how do we get from point A to point B? How do we lead learners through the curriculum to the outcomes of the curriculum in terms of the main steps that we acquired through cognitive task analysis? So the utilization structure is basically teaching in a manner that the first to be taught are topics that will be used first, and then topics taught next that are used next, and so forth. So this is maybe something you want to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is that on the concept-related structure, an adaptation of that strategy is very important, called the elaboration model. And that elaboration model by Ringluth is fundamental to helping people organize new knowledge, which, as you know from your Learning 525 class, helping people to organize knowledge is one of the instructional experiences that we can provide our learners. And it's one of the fundamental processes of learning in the information processing theory. So the Ringluth's use of the elaboration model and specifically the epitome is very critical strategy for you to consider using. Here's a good example of the elaboration structure and the epitome in use. You remember EDUC 525, the Challenges in Urban Education learning class, and you remember the gap analysis process, where early on in the class you were presented with this model of gap analysis, and your instructor may have actually walked through the process of this gap analysis of setting goals, measuring the current achievement, gaps, and what the causes were, etc. So if your instructor actually challenged you and invited you to follow along with the explanation of the model, then that instructor was actually employing the epitome, in which you could take a problem of practice during that first class and, on a very superficial way, walk through the complete gap analysis process. And that would be an epitome. Why is that helpful? Because everything that followed in that class all fit within one of these stages of the gap analysis model. To further illustrate the power of the elaboration model and the epitome tool, I want to show you a slide of the elaboration model in action. And this is actually, I believe this is from either Smith and Reagan or from another source. But basically, the elaboration model here shows the actual sequence of the using the USC library system to search for literature. Actually, it's to use any library system to search for literature. So you can reflect back on your process for searching for literature in the USC libraries to see whether or not you have done it correctly, or let's put it more succinctly, more effectively and efficiently searching for literature. So you can see then that it starts with selecting the appropriate database and then formatting a research inquiry, performing that research, and then selecting the results. And this is the knowledge hierarchy. This is what the prerequisite analysis that you completed on your curriculum design. This is one for searching the electronic resources at a library, in particular USC library. Okay, so how might we design a curriculum to do that? We might design a curriculum using the epitome by first presenting a simplified version of the process of searching for literature. At USC, this simplified version often starts at the home page of the USC libraries. After logging in, you're presented with this home page in which you can actually start your research by completing that white bar there and putting in some keywords. So you're actually getting an instantaneous experience of using the electronic resources in a simplified way by starting your research there. You very quickly, in that first unit of our course, our training course, you can actually go and look at one of the other tabs right below search, which is refine your search. And you can look at it from various subjects within that search. And then in the next little section or module of our first unit, we may look at the database quick links. You can actually see which databases might be more appropriate. And then finally, you can be introduced to the advanced search, which gives you the most power, and you would be reviewing then what are the potential fields that you could search on and the various tools that you could use. So in your first training module, if you will, or the first course, if you will, then you're actually seeing the whole picture of what can be done with the electronic libraries in terms of very deep searches to get very specific returns. And what we know about getting returns in your electronic research results is that the returns should be accurate and complete. In other words, it's giving you exactly what you want, and it's giving you all the resources at your fingertips that you can select from. Now, let's see how this elaboration model and using the epitome may work in our training course for using electronic resources to conduct searches of the literature. This again is our knowledge hierarchy or prerequisite analysis for conducting electronic searches. And we looked at this before, and we said that there were 4 modules corresponding to the 4 main tasks, if you will, of searching for the literature. And in the epitome, we gave the overview of searching for literature. And now in the remaining 4 units, we're actually going to delve deeper into each one of these. And to show you the power then of how this works together with the scope and sequence, I'm going to show you a very, very simplified version of a scope and sequence for this training curriculum. As you can see, our 4 units or modules, or if they're substantial enough to be courses, are listed along the top that correspond to our main tasks. and selecting a database, formulating your search, performing that search, and selecting results. And each one of the prerequisite or knowledge analysis or skills that are required to be performed for each one of these is then listed down on the first column. We could consider these as being the desired outcomes of this curriculum, that they're able to do the 4 things at the top and do and conduct this search using all of the skills along the first column. So then you can see then how it's introduced in the field of study and the period of time in the first unit, and then in the second unit we have introducing research terms, thesaurus, and combining terms. You can see this in that knowledge hierarchy if you go back to that slide. But wait a minute, let's look at something here. The R's in Unit 2. There's an R on field of study and the R on period of time. What does that mean? Well, you're reinforcing the skill of selecting the correct field of study you want and the period of time. How are you reinforcing the skill? Well, you might be giving the students or having the students conduct a new search with a new topic or a related topic. It doesn't matter, but it's a new context, and they have to apply the skill to the new context. Once again, we call that transfer of learning. And as you can see in Unit 2 and Unit 3, they're given the opportunities to practice or reinforce this skill until it's mastered in Unit 4. And you can see that happen throughout these skills and throughout the units. So let's go back to our scope and sequence table for the Masters in Learning Design and Technology. This, I do want to say that this is probably an early version of the scope and sequence that most likely changed as the curriculum was further designed and vetted with the design team, instructional designers, but it does just illustrate a few points. The main point that it illustrates is the importance of conducting scope and sequence, the importance of creating the scope and sequence table. First of all, it is going to guide your lesson planning. You have diagnosed, or if you will, analyzed your types of knowledge in your units, and now you're thinking, how am I going to teach each knowledge type? And as you can see in Smith and Reagan, there are strategies for teaching each kind of knowledge, each type of knowledge. But the scope and sequence allows us to be able to say, if we are seeking expertise or mastery of skills, then we have to give people the opportunity to practice them often and to develop that expertise and demonstrate it in the mastery in an assignment or some other way of demonstration of the mastery of the skill. So number one is of importance, and why we use it is to guide our lesson planning and the details of our lesson planning. The second reason why we conduct a scope and sequence is to look at the table visually and see where gaps are. Now these may be gaps in instruction between introduction of ideas or skills and reinforcement, or they may be gaps where the instruction ends too soon, or there is a gap between reinforcement and mastery, because as we know from our learning class, that if skills are not practiced, then they decay, if you will. So we can see visually where the introduction, reinforcements, and mastery are occurring for these outcomes, proficiencies, or skills down in the first column. And we can ask questions about whether or not it's desirable or not. It's not a right or wrong. There's lots that goes into this, which is, again, the context, the learner's prior knowledge, and other prescriptive ideas that go into the instructional design of the curriculum. But at least we can ask the question. So, for example, in the row of the first skill of describe and apply research, There is a gap between the reinforcement of the summer of 2015 and that course, and again between the fall of 2015. There seems to be a gap. Is that gap desirable, or should the courses between those two R's, the EDUC 595 course and the other course, which is difficult to read, but should that space there conclude an opportunity for students to practice, describe, and apply research? Again, there's no right or wrong answers here, and it's just a question of giving you the opportunity to ask that question. Further down, there is evaluate and align media to support learning. Well, that occurs about halfway through. The introduction of that occurs halfway through the program. So is that desirable, or is it desirable to introduce it early on in some way and then reinforce it during that course, which is during the instructional design course? So again, no right or wrong answers. It's just a question to ask of the design, that the way it's been created or is being created. Interesting on the last two, demonstrate academic writing and create, lead, and participate. Here, mastery occurs. We demonstrate mastery in the summer of 2015, the very beginning in that course. And so an interesting thing is that if it's mastered there, by the time students achieve or reach the end of their Master Studio B at the very last course, do they still retain those skills? Or again, should it be reinforced in the summer of 2015, the fall of 2015? Again, no right or wrong answers, but it's just a question to ask. And the only way you could ask that question is that if you can see is visually about where these gaps are in the scope and sequence. And finally, the third important consideration for conducting scope and sequence is connected with articulation. Articulation means how is the curriculum design created so that one unit builds on the next and it leads to transfer of learning. And these concepts expand into ideas about correlation, or the correlation of one course taught by instructor A with another course, instructor B. So the two courses are closely correlated to create coherence. And whether or not we're considering the student experience as these courses are put together. And so what you want to do is to create or decide to create a student-centered experience where there's coherence and continuity of skills throughout courses, so that students are truly reaching mastery level on the outcomes that you intended when you designed the course in the first place. To bring this point home, consider again your Learning 525 course and this gap analysis process model and the curriculum in the EDD program. And ask yourself, to what extent was the curriculum coherent? Was one course tied with another course? Was the framework that you learned to problem solve in learning, was it prepared for and had correlation with what you learned in courses before you took learning and in courses after you took learning? And you can ask yourself whether or not that occurred in the curriculum. The answer to that is very, very complex, and the answer to that, again, there's no right or wrong answers, but it's a way of thinking about, if it was different, of how every single course built upon another course, what might the experience have been in terms of the outcomes desired for your EDD program. Interesting ideas to think about. And that's a little bit about scope and sequence and the importance of it.